born in Fargo, lived on a farm at Davenport, about 25 miles southwest of town. I lived on the farm till I went away to school. McDonald was a neighbor of ours. Alec McDonald. His farm is 2 miles west of our farm. So we grew up knowing, as buddies. Mac had a cousin named Floyd Plath, and, an older gentleman. He was a businessman, had a machinery dealership in Kindred, and also lived on the farm, which was right between Mac's and our place. So I would either ride my bike or my pony over to Mac's and, spend some time with him. And one afternoon, about 4 or 5 o'clock, I was coming back home, and Floyd landed he had a runway right by his yard, and he had an Aranca Chief, a little Aranca, two placed side by side. And he landed, and I just steered, it was about a block into his farm. I rode over there, and I had been fascinated by airplanes, but I didn't know, I'd never been around them, and never had ridden in one. And he taxied right into the yard, right in front of the house, spun it around, and I walked around the airplane and said, "Hi, Mr. Plath." He said, "Hi, Darrell." And I said, "I've never had an airplane ride." And he called into his wife, "Esther, I'll be right back. Jump in." So he took off right from the yard, right from the driveway. And I was just absolutely thrilled. Oh. I was about 11 years old, probably been in 1941. Probably a few months before Pearl Harbor. This was in summer, and then Pearl Harbor hit December 7th. That just started the whole thing. And he just gave me a short ride, but did a little pull-up over a grain elevator and did some negative G's, and I'd never felt that before, and it just fascinated me. And I read books and drew pictures of airplanes, and in high school, well, I'll make a long story very short. My parents went out to Arizona in the wintertime, and they did spend some winters out there. And the first time they didn't want to interrupt my school because they didn't have a place to live. So my mother's sister, my aunt, she was 21. She worked at the Merchants Bank as a bookkeeper and had an apartment in North Fargo, a 2-bedroom apartment. So they asked if I could stay until Christmas with her. And I started school at Roosevelt on the north side. It was only about 2 blocks from where she lived. So I did that. Christmas came, and they didn't want to interrupt me again. They said, "Why don't you just stay and finish out the year?" So I did. Then I went to Fargo Central, and it was during the war, and the school in Davenport was losing a lot of teachers, especially the men were all gone, and quite a few parents sent their kids to Castleton, Kindred, or Fargo to school. And there were 4 or 5 of us that lived in Fargo, either roomed with relatives or with someone. Well, when I was a junior in high school, I really had the flying bug bad, and I would hitchhike out to the airport, and the war was just over then. It just had, they just started doing some GI Bill training, and Dakota Skyways was an FBO right in that round hangar right south of the old tower, that round hangar. That's where Dakota Skyways was. They had a number of training airplanes, a lot of GI Bill students. And so I asked them about flying lessons, and I was the only non-GI Bill. I was a high school kid. They didn't have any other high school kids taking lessons. And my dad would give me $5 a week. He put some money in the savings account. My aunt would bring me $5 from the bank every week for spending money. And you could get $8 an hour for dual instruction. I could get 3/4 hour for $5. So I spent I'd hitchhike to the airport, out to Hector, spent my $5, I'd get about 45 minutes of instruction. And my instructor had flown, had been a Navy pilot in World War II, Oscar Ness, and real nice, just a fine guy. And he joined the Air Guard, was flying 51s, and I just thought that was fantastic. And then he was instructing. So when spring came, he said, you're going to have your dad's permission before I console you, which I didn't really realize. Well, my dad came home early to put the crop in, we had a hired man that stayed on the farm while he was gone, but he came home like in April or first part of May. And so weekends I'd go out to the farm and stay with Dad. And this one weekend I said, I need to have you come into town and sign something. Sign something? What's this all about? And I told him, well, I'm taking some classes at the airport. I did say I'm learning how to fly, and so it ended up that we had coffee with Oscar Ness at the old terminal coffee bar, and he convinced my dad that he should sign that release so I could be soloed. My dad was very hesitant. I think he was a little upset with me that I did this. He was just, but he did sign it. So a couple weeks later, I was taking a lesson. We taxied out the north end, and Mr. Ness said, okay, kid, I'm getting out. I'll watch you do 3 landings. I couldn't believe it. So I soloed. I just turned 16. That was in 46, in the spring of 46. Now when I was in college, I will move ahead a few years, I was going out and renting an airplane once in a while, and they had Veronica Champs, and they had some PT-26s and PT-19s that they'd brought in surplus. And I got checked out in one of those, which fascinated me. Well, I was living at a fraternity house, and heard a knock on the door, and this guy came to see me, and he was a mechanic at the airport and had bought a PT-19, and they were selling him surplus. They were coming in from Canada, and he lost his job and got transferred to someplace, and he had to sell the airplane. And he asked me if I could buy it. I said, no way, I'm just a college kid. My dad has put me through school, but I can't buy an airplane. He kept pestering me, and he stopped out about once a week, and about the third time he stopped out, he said, what are you asking for it? Well, he wanted $700 for it to begin with. That was just, well, there was no way I was even considering that, but I liked the airplane. It was a nice PT-19. Well, it ended up, he had to move, and he said, how much money can you put together? And 4 of us put in $50 apiece. We bought it for $200. And I was the only one who knew how to fly, and I just barely had a private license then. So I did turn into a flight instructor with some of my buddies, and it's just amazing we survived all that, because I didn't know much about flying myself, and here I was teaching them how to fly. But one of them sold his $50 share, and then the 3 of us stayed with it. And about that next summer, I took it out to the farm and landed in the hayfield. My dad he didn't care for that. And a friend of my dad's convinced him that I'm going to get hurt in that airplane. So my dad told me, sell it. So I did. Sold it for $200 to a guy that I asked him if he'd flown one. He said no. And I said, well, I can fly with you and show you, how to fly it. He said, well, I have a cousin that was a World War II bomber pilot, and he's going to check me out in it. I heard about a week later that a PT-19 crashed out at Sky Ranch Airport. It was right where Sunmart is on the south side. There was a landing strip there, and that's where the airplane was. I went out there, and it was just really broken up. And what happened was they came in on final in the first landing and pulled full flaps and stalled out. He just went in on the nose, and neither one got hurt. They've got bruised up, but both seat belts broke, and they were very fortunate they didn't get hurt. So years later, I came off active duty in the late 50s, and I started ag flying, and I brought an airplane in for a little repair work, and I was waiting for it. And I was sitting in the sun beside the hangar with this other ag pilot from Christine, and we were talking about flying and learning how to fly, and I told him I'd had a PT-19 in college, and he said, yes. He said, I know that. And I said, how come? Well, he said, I was the one that crashed it. Harvey Allman, he'd flown I think B-25s in World War II a little bit. He said I was on current, and I had been in one, and I just stalled it out and landed. And so we kind of laughed about that. So that's what happened to that airplane. I did join the Air Guard when I was a senior in high school in Fargo Central. That was in 40, no, I was a junior. That was in 1949 when the unit started, when they started the Guard unit, the Air Guard. And one of the recruiters came out and he recruited, there were about 45 of our senior class that joined the Air Guard. And we, of course, they assigned us to different jobs. And I was assigned to aircraft maintenance because I wanted to be around airplanes as an A&P mechanic. Well, I wasn't very mechanical, but I was around airplanes, which I appreciated. And I had a 3-year enlistment. And then Mac joined the following year. He joined in 48. And he just started NDSU then. In 1950, I decided to go into advanced ROTC. Well, I had to drop out of the Guard because of you couldn't belong to both organizations. So I dropped out of out of the Guard, started ROTC, and 2 weeks later the Guard was activated for Korea, which would have changed my whole career. Didn't know they were going to be activated. But I stayed in school and got my commission, and I really had decided on a career in the Air Force. And that was my goal. I was going to go on active duty, and that was going to be my career. So I graduated, and when we graduated in 52, of course, it was during the height of the Korean War, kind of towards getting close to the end of it, which we didn't know. So we got our orders and our commission and our active duty orders and our diploma all the same day. And so I was anxious to go on active duty and report for pilot training. Well, an interesting thing happened. My orders started me in August, so I had to spend the summer working on the farm, baling hay and combining. And finally, I reported in 6 August 52 to Perrin Air Force Base, which is right north of Dallas. And I checked in, and the base adjutant said, "You're at the wrong base." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "They just decided to not have pilot training here anymore. And they called it FlyTAP, Flying Training Air Force, and we're going to be a crew training Air Force with FA-6Ds when they come out of the factory brand new. We're going to start a training air crews." Well, so I was the first one of 46 people that came into the base. 2 other ones from Fargo, Dick Ames and Charles Finnegan, who was a very close friend of mine in high school and college. They reported in after I did. So we all were pipelined to other training bases. They had 9 civilian contract schools then that they would train, your first primary, your first 6 months. I didn't get my orders till about January. So we sat there from August until January, but it wasn't all bad. I was very fortunate being the first one because I got assigned to an aircraft maintenance squadron. He had brand new T-28s, which was a brand new trainer then. And it was built, the cockpit was built similar to the F-86 cockpit, only, it wasn't a jet, it was a radial engine airplane, but all the controls and the instruments were just very similar to an F-86. Well, the maintenance officer took me along on test tops, and he knew I had some previous flying, so he'd let me fly the airplane. Then he'd fill out his paperwork while I was running the test top. So I got quite a few rides in the T-28, which was really good training for me. Just by chance, it really helped when I went into pilot training. Then, in the meantime, I'd gotten engaged. I met Jean in college. She was a senior when I was a freshman, and she happened to be homecoming queen that year when she was a senior, and I really thought she was a beautiful lady. And a fraternity brother of mine who was also a senior was dating her, and we were both in the ski club together, and I kind of got to know her, thought she was a very nice person. Well, at Christmas time, he went home on Christmas vacation, and my folks were in Arizona, so I stayed at the fraternity house, and I called Jean and invited her to a movie, and she got a big kick out of it because a freshman. But she knew me from the ski club, so she said she'd go, so she probably wanted to see the movie. So that kind of ignited things a little bit, but we didn't date a lot, but we stayed in very close touch. She went into business. She started the magazine called The Town Crier, which evolved into Binford's Guide, which evolved into The Guide. So she started that, and she had her own business going. And then I'll move ahead. When I was down in Texas at Perrin Air Force Base, we did get engaged. She came down on a trip with another friend. They'd been down in Texas. She stopped, and we dated, and I offered to get engaged to her, got her a ring, and we set the wedding date for the first part of February in Fargo. And I was delaying en route to my pilot training class. We had a lot of faith and guts, you might say, to set a wedding date when things were changing so much. And we sent invitations out, and we had a big wedding at the Olivet Church here in town, where her folks had belonged. And our marriage was on a Friday evening, and I had to report for pilot training on Monday morning in Moultrie, Georgia. No interstates, and I had a brand new Oldsmobile, and we drove kitty corner all the way across to Georgia on our honeymoon to start pilot training. So that was a pretty interesting experience. We didn't have any housing. They didn't have base. It was a civilian contract school, so we had to find our own housing in that little town of Moultrie, which we did after being in a motel for a few days. And then I joined up with 2 or 3 other friends of mine who'd been at Perrin, also came, and they were married at the time. They were all waiting to meet this new wife of mine, so we remained friends for many years later. So that was 6 months of primary, flying the T6. And when I graduated from primary, it was in the middle of summer. We went to Bryan Air Force Base, Texas, which is at College Station, Texas, right where Texas A&M is. Now it's a closed air base, but it was a nice base then. We really enjoyed it. We lived in housing right next to the campus of Texas A&M. So that was where I checked out in the T-28 again. Flew that for about 2 or 3 months, and then checked out in the T-33. That was my first jet that I flew. So we graduated from there in December of that year of '53. And there were 65 in my graduating class, and we had all kinds of different assignments, from helicopters to B-29s, B-36s, which was fairly new then, and F-84s, but they had 6 F-86 assignments. Now, when we graduated, we could put down our preference, the first 3, 1, 2, and 3, but the instructors really assigned us. I mean, they'd look at your preference, but I put F-86 in all 3 of them, which I'm sure they laughed about. And I did get an F-86 assignment, which I was very fortunate about. They were brand new then. I mean, they were quite new. And everybody wanted to fly the F-86, the Sabre. So I went to Nellis Air Force Base, that's fighter gunnery school. And they also trained F-84 pilots at Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix. But I didn't want to fly the 84, I wanted to fly the 86. So and this Finnegan, who I'd mentioned before, who I'd gone to high school and college with, and we were at Perrin together, and then he went to different flying training bases than I did, but we joined up at Nellis again, and we got the same flight instructor. You'd go through with the same instructor, 3 students and an instructor, 4 of us. So we went through training together in the F-86, which was a lot of fun. And it was really a thrill to fly that airplane. We flew the F-80 for about 40 hours. That was like a T-33 with a single seat in it. And we flew that, did some strafing and dive bombing and low angle strafe and all that. Then we checked out in '86, and we had no idea. We thought we were all going to Korea because that's where all the graduates were going. At that time, it was the busiest airfield in the world. They had a big sign by the main gate, busiest airfield in the world. They trained, they had over 100 F-86s there, and probably that many F-80s. And in the morning, on the first takeoff, we'd have 50 to 100 airplanes taxiing out. And it was just incredible. The flights of 4 were going out, one after another. So it was very intense training, and we did strafing and dive bombing and skip bombing, and we did high altitude gunnery with the 50 calibers on a rag, they called it. They'd drag it behind another airplane, and we'd did a lot of that. So then when we got our orders, the first orders came out for Korea. They came out about a month before graduation, and we just assumed that's where we'd be going. And right at graduation, they called a number of us, maybe 15 or 20 of us, into a building and gave us a briefing that we were going to be reassigned to a new base that had been a World War II base, and they were reopening it for a new mission, and we were going to get brand new airplanes right out of the factory. Well, we had no idea what this was all about, but it was Clovis Air Force Base, which is now called Cannon, down in New Mexico. It had been a World War II bomber base, but it had been closed, for 8-9 years, I suppose. So we drove to Clovis. They didn't have any housing on the base, so we had to search for a typical thing, and we lived in a motel for a couple of weeks. We just had real tough times, and we ended up finding a house, and it was not what I would have picked today, but we had no choice. So we moved into that home in Clovis, and it was really a thrill to get into a new squadron. Now I was a very brand new graduate from pilot training, and had been checked out in the F-86 and thought I was probably the hottest fighter pilot in the world. They said, you're going to have a mission that's going to be called a special weapons mission. And that's the first time I'd ever heard special weapons. And they said, we're going to fill out applications for a top secret clearance because it's a very unique mission. And you're all going to have to get a top secret clearance before you do that mission. So we're going to put the application now because they have to do background checks. They do that right around your home area and everything. I really didn't. I just thought, I took it for granted and didn't really give a thought of what it really meant. Well, then when we get down to Clovis, we were told that the new pilots were to go to this one certain area on the base, and I went over there, and here it was a big fence around it with guards, and it was a very classified building. So they briefed us on the mission a little bit. They told us that special weapons meant that we were going to be training to drop an atomic bomb. And I thought, an atomic bomb? That's bomber business. Well, this was a new bomb built for a fighter, for a new delivery method called LABS, Low Altitude Bombing System. And so we had to wait for about a month to get our clearances come through so we could go start classes. And once we got that top secret clearance, then we started classes on studying. Well, we'd go every day for a couple hours and study about this bomb. And they had diagrams of it, and they had a shape, which was a bomb without the nuclear in it. And so it was pretty complicated at that time because I didn't have a degree in electrical engineering. There was a lot of wiring and a lot of things you had to know about the bomb, and it was really more memorizing for me than it was just the practical looking at how this bomb worked, and if you started having problems, how you detect the problems, how you could fix them. So it was really a matter of doing a lot of memorizing on my part. And we were tested. Every week we'd have a test on all this. And if you didn't pass the test, you were transferred to another base. So we really worked pretty hard at, we didn't want to be transferred. So that's why we were called a fighter bomber wing. Now some of the F-86s were assigned to day fighter wings. And later on, when the D model came out, which was the one with the radome in the nose, then they were fighter interceptor wings, but we were a fighter bomber wing. Our secondary mission was day fighter, but our primary mission was dropping an atomic bomb. This was towards the end of 1953, or at the beginning of 1954. That was really the height of the Cold War, because we had a huge threat from Russia at that time. And of course they had atomic weapons also. And you know, we had pretty good intelligence, and they of course did too, so it was really a matter of deterrence, really. Our country never wanted to be the first one to drop the bomb, but we wanted to be able to retaliate immediately. So that's what this was all about, was immediate retaliation. We got orders. We were all called in, all 3 squadrons on our base were called into the base theater, and we were briefed on the fact that we were going over to Europe. And we were going to be based in France. And they were building new bases in France, around 10 of them. And not all for the same fighters, but different for transports and bombers and that type of thing. And so we were going to, there was a NATO commitment to have a wing of F-86s with that mission, with the atomic mission, in place by January 1st of 1955. That was a NATO order. So we started preparing then. We knew we'd be leaving for Europe sometime in the fall of '54. And so we were, in the meantime, we were training very heavily in F-86 for that new mission. And we had a range, a practice range, only about 30 miles off the base. And we'd go out there clean without tanks on, with a canister of practice bombs in it. They were a lead, 9-pound piece of lead with a smoke charge in. And we started doing at first we started doing Immelmans, come in at 500 knots, right on the deck, 50 foot, and we'd pull up into a 4G Immelman. Immelmans were when you get on your back, then you roll it out and you fly the opposite direction. So we did that for a couple of months. We did hundreds of Immelmans, and we'd toss these bombs. And our F-86s were specially instrumented. They had a lot of instruments above the shroud, and they were gyros so we could do this Immelman perfectly and they were non-tumbling gyros, so when you get on your back, they don't tumble. And then the G meter was primary. They moved that right up to the center, so you kept it right on 4 Gs, because it had to be very accurate. If you got a wing over, the bomb would be tossed a different direction. And anyway, that was a lot of work. We'd go out 3-4 missions a day. They're only 35-40 minutes, and drop 2 or 3 of these. Then if we did real well and qualified, we could go to air gunnery and practice, which we all really enjoyed doing, and some high-angle strafe and high-angle bombing and skip bombing, conventional gunnery. So we had 2 missions, the atomic mission and conventional both. So it was a lot of work. We really flew our butts off, just flew every day, 2-3 times a day. We finally got our orders to depart. The base wasn't ready yet in France, and it kept delaying and delaying. We thought we'd go in the middle of summer, which would have been the right time to take a high flight over the North Atlantic, because you just don't do that in wintertime. Because, see, we couldn't refuel the F-86 in flight. We had to land all the way, we had to hedge hop all the way across. Because max range was about 2 hours and 30 minutes, real max. Usually 2 hours was pretty max, but if you really went up to 40-some thousand feet, you could get 2.5 hours out of it. So it was rather limited in range. Well, we finally got our orders in November to deploy to Europe. Well, 75 airplanes took off out of Clovis, New Mexico in flights of 4 by squadron. And by the time we got to Limestone, Maine, now we landed the first night we spent in Alexandria, Louisiana, the second night in Dover, Delaware, the third night in Limestone, Maine. So it took quite a while to just get to our departure out of the U.S. In the meantime, we lost one airplane in Dover, Delaware, and the pilot survived it though, but totaled the airplane out. And so we spent, in fact, I remember we landed at Pope Air Base in Carolina for noon lunch, and it was Thanksgiving Day. We had turkey in a mess hall on silver trays. And then we got to Limestone, Maine, and by that time we had airplanes starting to scatter with maintenance problems, and they were changing flights. It was turning into a real, I hate to say mess, but by that time it was really interesting. And that's where we went into our, what we call poopy suits. There was our immersion suits. They were terrible. They were a rubber immersion suit with rubber bands around the wristlets, around the neck, and very, very uncomfortable and very cumbersome. But we had tested them at Cloviston swimming pool for leaks, and then they flew them in a transport over to Limestone. And that's what we had to wear on our over-water flights. And it was just, you could hardly get in the cockpit. You had to have the crew chief help you, and you could hardly move, and the cockpit wasn't that big anyway. It was just a real hazard in itself. So we took off in flights of 4. We always flew in flights of 4. Beasley was the flight commander in my flight, and Tony Bartello and Don Ron and myself were the wingmen. And we took off for Limestone. Now gets to be a real story. We took off from Limestone, Maine to Goose Bay, Labrador. The weather forecast changed when we got midway over Mont-Gelais, that's up in Quebec, and they told us to return to Limestone. We just passed the point of no return. They had a blizzard on the base, but we had to press on. We got about 15 minutes from the base, and we heard a lot of interesting garble on the radio, and the flight ahead of us was trying to land in this weather, and one of the pilots in the flight was our wing commander, Brigadier General Wisnan, just had made brigadier. He was a World War II type, and he got shook off the wing. He wasn't leading the flight. He was flying wing, and he got shook off the wing and did a roll in the soup and recovered, climbed up on top, just about out of fuel, and the tops were about 16,000 feet, and he was circling over the base and was in a total panic. So Beasley, my flight commander, told me to move out to number 5, and he joined up on Beasley's wing. So I moved an hour in a 5-ship formation, and the weather at that time was 0-0 on the base. We didn't have, radar went off the air, they lost current on the base, runaway lights were out, of course it was the daytime. So we had what they called ADF, just an automatic direction finder, low frequency radio, which was about 5 miles off the base. And Beasley he decided to keep us all together. If we'd have split up into flights, he's too hazardous. Now we're in a 5-ship formation, and we're starting our penetration to land. And I never saw anything until I touched down. And he split the runway. I mean, to do an ADF, he tracked from, outbound tracking about 5 miles with a crosswind and in a blizzard. And we all landed on the runway. And I had moved into the slot because I knew if I was out on number 3 on the wing, the runway wasn't wide enough, so I moved into the slot like the Thunderbirds. I had my nose about 4 feet behind the tailpipe of Beasley. And as soon as we touched down, I thought for sure I'd overrun or would run into him, so I stop-cocked the throttle, shut it off, got on the brakes, and tried not to skid, but did heavy braking. And when I stopped, I opened the canopy, and I couldn't see anything except snow. And a Jeep drove up, And the snow by that time was about, oh, it looked like it was darn near a foot deep all over. And I slid down, he didn't have a ladder, so I slid down into the Jeep, and I was about 1,000 feet behind the other four, so I stopped pretty quick. And then we were stuck there for 2 weeks. The general put Beasley in for the Distinguished Flying Cross, and all the three of us for air medals. We never got them, though, because it was a SAC base, and they weren't issuing medals for that type of thing. But it was they've written that up in a number of stories about that. So we spent 2 weeks there. Then we took off for Greenland. And that was an interesting runway. We landed in Narsarsuaq Air Base, which is called Bluey West 1. It's on the southern tip of Greenland, and you have to fly up a fjord. And the runway was an uphill 5,000-foot runway with hard-packed snow and ice. And we didn't have drag chutes, or we didn't have hooks or anything. So we had to be sure we landed minimum speed going uphill, because there was a 300-foot drop into a housing area off the end of the runway. And you couldn't make a go-around because there's a mountain off the end, 7,000-foot mountain. So once you saw the runway, we'd fly in trail with our gear and flaps down. We met a seaplane called an SA-16 duck butt off the southern tip of Greenland. He'd circle, and we'd meet him, and he'd lead us up this fjord in trail. We were all four of us, maybe 500 feet behind each one. And then I could see the runway up ahead, a black runway. But it wasn't black, it was ice on it. And then we all landed, we all made it. Everybody, 75 airplanes made it through, 74, we'd lost one by then. And, but we weren't, when I landed there were only probably a dozen of us that had gotten that far. The rest are all still behind us. And we spent another 2 weeks there. Spent Christmas in Greenland. It was nothing to do, just an open bay barracks and an officers club. And it was, we had a number of, it was dark all the time, down to 30 below at night. And, our airplanes were all sitting outside being cold, so hydraulic fluid just dripping out of them. A round patch, a red patch underneath each one with hydraulic fluid. And you wondered how it was going to run after sitting there for a couple of weeks. So, and we had so many dry runs where we'd get suited up in our poopy suits, which took about an hour, go to a briefing, and then say, oh, the weather's bad. And so we did that maybe 4 or 5 times. And finally one morning we left. And there we went to Iceland, to Keflavik Air Base in Iceland. It wasn't a real long flight, about an hour and a half, but very hazardous. We took off downhill, single ship, and it was overcast. Not real low, but then we joined up on top. And we climbed to about 30,000 feet, and we spread out. I looked down, I could see whitecaps. 30,000 feet and icebergs all over, just icebergs and whitecaps. And I'm not an overwater guy, I never was in single seat airplane, single engine airplane. And we landed on an icy runway in Keflavik and spent 4 days there. And then we had the longest leg from there down to Prestwick, Scotland. And that was at least a 2-hour flight. And water all, the whole way. No emergency landing spots at all. New Year's Eve in Keflavik. And by that time we were pretty much starting to gang up. We'd had a few stragglers, but I suppose over half of our unit was there. And we thought for sure we'd have New Year's Day off, because boy, it was pretty hazardous trip. That was over a month we'd been en route already, close to 40 days, 12 hours of flying time to get to Europe, but sitting all these different bases in the weather. So about 6 o'clock that evening, they called over from headquarters in Germany and said, you got to leave the next morning, leave at 8 o'clock. So New Year's Day we launched a whole bunch of airplanes, and we flew into 3 different German bases. My squadron went to Bitburg. The 62nd Squadron, where Finnegan was in, went to Spangdahlem, which was about 20 miles away. And then the other squadron went up to Hahn, Germany, which was up north, maybe 80, 90 miles. So they said we'd be there for about a month at the most in Germany.